The class will necessarily involve some heavy lifting through academic sources, but will also apply practical conversational steps and lifestyle choices which enhance, verify, and sub-broadcast. Where did that come from? I'm going to have to beat my secretary. I'm sorry, I don't know where that came from. Oh, excuse me. Study of apologetics will have two main courses. Strengthen the individual Christian's faith, which will lead to, supposed to be A, emboldening the individual's Christian testimony and witnessing. In my experience, witnessing and apologetics made my faith grow and driven me deeper into God's Word, into the history of the church, into the study of different religions and cultures, and into a serious life of prayer, as the need for the Holy Spirit's help in the mission endeavor becomes so clear. This leads to an even greater desire to share the faith and has built confidence in the Scriptures and in sound thinking as one approaches the non-Christian world. All right, let me just summarize that because it's driving me crazy just to read it. It looks so bad. First person that I actually, this is going to be hard. First person I really tried to witness to in any real way, I'd been a Christian about 8 months, was a Mormon. I hardly knew what I believed. I knew nothing about what he believed. And in about 5 minutes, I was turned into a pretzel, and I had no idea what the heck was going on. And I was with another young Christian. We were out doing at the time in the 70s, there was this thing called Evangelism Explosion, just two simple questions, which even we could do, which was, if you were to die tonight, do you know if you'd go to heaven? And so we were just kind of canvassing the neighborhood doing this. And my friend Debbie, good Christian girl, but her response to being turned into a pretzel was pretty typical of most Christians. And that was, I am never speaking to these people again as long as I live. And that's probably where a whole lot of y'all have been. I would say that's the majority of the Christian church. First time you've had interaction with something like that, or fill in the blank with an atheist, with an antagonistic brother-in-law, or whatever it is. Most of us are intimidated. We just won't respond. Or we've tried to respond once and it hasn't gone the way we thought it's supposed to go, and so our response to it is just pull back and say, you know what, God will take care of these people because I'm done. Now, maybe it's just my obnoxious personality, I don't know, but it made me study. It made me go back to my spiritual dad and basically say, all right, why did he say this? And what does the Bible say about that? And what's going on here? And it made me get back and study more. And the more I studied the Bible, the more I also studied what the Mormons were saying, started picking up books. And I was working at Cinderella City in Inglewood while I was in Bible college. Some of you, if you've been in town for a while, you remember Cinderella City. And Sin City was one of the biggest malls in the western part of the United States. And we had, in the 70s, everybody down there. We had the Moonies, we had the Children of God, we had the Hare Krishnas. We had all sorts of fun people that would hang around that mall. And so if you were of a mindset, you could get in a discussion very, very quickly with people. And so every time I was talking to a different one of them, it made me study more, right? Because every group was different, seemed to emphasize different things. It made me learn more about the Bible. And it just became sort of a routine, was talking to people out, actually seeking them out, as opposed to the Hare Krishnas chasing you down in the airport, which is what they used to do. Some of you older ones might remember. I now chase them down, and they run almost as fast as we used to. The point is that, in fact, I just was at a conference this last week sponsored by the Evangelical Ministry to New Religions. And most of the people in that are people from different parts of the country who do something similar to what I do. Unfortunately, the majority of them call themselves apologists to defend the faith. And I don't use that term. For one, I have to spend a lot of time explaining to you what it means in any real sense. I have been a missionary for 15 plus years full time. And I believe apologetics in its proper place is a proper part of being a missionary. It doesn't substitute for missions. There's all sorts of other tools that are involved in mission work. But it is a very important part when you're dealing with people who actually do have questions. Let me ask you this. How many of you were raised in a Christian church? Raise your hands. Okay, and if you weren't? A few of you. I would guess, if I were to interview the 4 or 5 that were not, that you probably had some real objections to Christianity. I know I did. Christianity is for idiots. You had to check your brain at the door if you believed this stuff. Both my mom and dad were refugees from the Southern Baptist Church long before I was born. And that's how I was raised. You had to be an idiot to be a Christian. And so the kinds of things, the issues that I brought to the table when people tried to witness, if they ever try too hard, because I usually start cussing at them and you know, this kind of thing. But I did have real objections. You had to be an idiot not to believe in evolution. That's what I thought. I remember just convincingly thinking in 11th grade in high school in Los Angeles, after going through some lesson on evolution in my biology class, the evidence was so obvious. You'd have to be a moron not to believe this. And so my immediate thought was Christians are morons. That's exactly the track that I was on. And I would bet some of you were on that track as well. And I guarantee a whole lot of your friends and family and coworkers are on that track. I assume that's why a lot of you are in the first place, because hopefully you have an interest and a desire to reach out to those people. This is about missions, and it's about making you a more effective missionary. If you were to go, say if you got called as a missionary to Thailand, and you went to a mission board and they would give you the requirements. Well, you're going to have to learn, you're going to have to spend 2 years in language school, you're going to have to learn the culture, you're going to have to learn Buddhism, you have to learn all these different things about speaking with Thai people. Why? Because you wanted to be better conversant with them when you got there, correct? That's just part of what it means to be a missionary. Well, in this sense, especially the issues we're going to cover over the next 8 weeks, these are all things that people actually think about. I'm not interested in wasting anybody's time. I'm certainly not interested in wasting my time. Number one question that we'll spend the whole night on is the problem of evil, which I guarantee you every one of you in this room is old enough almost to have dealt with. And if you haven't dealt with it yet, you just wait, you will. Why does God allow my mom to get cancer and die? Why did God allow the tsunami? Why did God allow fill in the blank? I guarantee you, as many people as I talk to, whether they be New Agers or atheists or whatever they are, once you cut through a lot of the haze, that one comes up. And I believe it's the most human question there is. It's the one every human being wrestles with. You can go back to the first book we know of in the Bible, Job, and you see that question come up there. It comes up in the New Testament. It's come up through the history of the church. And it's probably the most aggressive attack that atheists have against Christians. How can you believe in a God who lets X happen? So that's a great question, and it's great for us to wrestle with, not just in dealing with atheists, but it will build your own faith as you start thinking this through. Most of the answers like on something like that are not things you're going to be able to use at a funeral. Oh, I've got a great word here that'll cheer my friend up with when their parents are dead. No rational answer necessarily helps at that moment. I can give great explanations. I believe I can build a very good case as to why evil happens in this world. But that's not going to answer the things that people wrestle with at a funeral. That's why, to me, an important part of being a missionary is that you have lots of tools in your toolbox. This is one of them. This is a very important one because I really do believe people have real questions. Coming from a non-Christian background, having a whole family full of non-Christians, and interacting with that world most of the time, I don't think they throw these questions out for free. I think they really do have objections. And one way, there's a very prominent writer that I really like, Ravi Zacharias. He described what we're about to do for the next 8 weeks as clearing all the bushes away that are in front of the cross, which I thought was a kind of a cute way of saying it, that people do have objections. At a certain point, you're going to take them to the cross. That's the whole point. The gospel is what saves people, not my incredibly wonderful argument about the problem of evil. But if you can get them to think that maybe their prejudices aren't the truth. I knew Christians hated music. I knew Christians were idiots. I knew Christians couldn't speak to me because they all said thee and thou and givest and all this. I just had this whole row full of preconceptions I had about Christians. I didn't actually know any Christians, but I didn't need to have all my preconceptions lined up. Thanks, Tim. So this is really critical. We're going to be dealing with a lot of important questions. And if you look through the syllabus here, let's cut through most of this because it's really a mess the way it printed out. This is a lot cleaner when I gave it to the seminary. I don't know what happened. Tonight, and we're doing the first two sections there, why apologetics, reasons for and against. Now, this, unfortunately, has become a big issue. There's a large movement in the church, which we're going to go into detail a little bit more tonight, that thinks apologetics is terrible. You shouldn't try to reason with people. You shouldn't use rationality. That's just really bad. And this is an outgrowth of postmodernism in the culture. And as it's come into the church, it's got a new name for itself. It's called the emerging church. And this is hot stuff in many places around the country. And they have a very long, detailed, it's hard to call it an argument because they're not supposed to be rational, but they've got an appeal as to why apologetics is no good, and I want to address some of that. And then you'll see the second section is also dated February 12th. Foundationalism, coherence, justified true belief, correspondence, and postmodernism. Again, don't get overwhelmed by the words. We'll walk through them. You're going to find most of them are pretty common sense, although I routinely will tell you that nobody can screw up simple ideas like philosophers. They can take the most simple, easy to understand idea that anybody can understand and, just turn it inside out so badly that nobody can make sense out of it. There's an old joke about a very important philosopher of the last 100 years named Wittgenstein. And a German fellow, and he's sitting on a park with another guy, and there's a tree in front of them. They're having this detailed, intense argument about whether that tree is actually there. And some gentleman walks by them and listens in on the conversation, has this look like I'm dealing with morons, and Wittgenstein sees him, looks over and says, no, sir, don't worry. We're not crazy. We're doing philosophy. That's a great illustration of what philosophy has done. And unfortunately, a lot of the ideas that push our culture are driven by philosophy. I've been in the university for a long time, and I guarantee you all these ideas that these people play with at the ivory tower, all of them make their way out to the streets and affect our culture. And because we are a part of the culture, they directly affect the Christian church. It's not accidental to me that about 90%, notice what I'm saying here, 90% of Christian kids raised in Christian churches believe that truth is relative. It's not absolute. There are no absolutes. That's a very, very incredibly important idea, a very disastrous idea. 90% of Christian kids think that way, and it's about 99% of non-Christian kids. They're swimming with ideas that have been around for a long time. They don't know where they came from. Somebody wrote a song. Somebody told it to them. Somebody, put it in a way that they could, eat it up easily, and presto, they're pure relativists. It's not an accident. I have lots of other illustrations that we'll go through, but you'll see that the ideas do affect us. The next week, apologetic theory. There are different ways that people have done, and I'm kind of eclectic in the sense that I believe that there's a wealth to gain from knowing some of these different ways of doing things. And we're going to look at some of the different ways. There's very different ends. There's a strong Calvinist approach, which is called presuppositionalist. They have some things to value there. Then there's other groups that don't quite agree with that approach, but have, say, like Josh McDowell, which is called evidentialism, the idea that there's plenty of evidence to make the case for Christ. So we'll look at some of the different things. Third week is arguments for the existence of God. There are some, and this is the fifth week, or fourth week as well, there's some very outstanding arguments that have been used. These ideas have been around for thousands of years. One of the first ones to really write about them was Aristotle, so that's 300 years before Christ. And in some sense, the fact that Aristotle and many other people around the world have come up with some of these ideas proves to me what the Bible already says. In Romans 1, it tells us that the non-believers knew who God was, but suppressed the truth in unrighteousness. For God had made it evident to them in nature. So this is something that was available not just to people who have the Bible, but to people everywhere. So when you see non-Christians arguing for the existence of a supreme being that must have created everything, then you see what Paul's really describing there. And so these are some good arguments we'll go through. One of them that's really hot right now is intelligent design. If you've read anything on intelligent design, which has become a big, big issue in our school systems around the country. It's a big thing for Christian thinkers in the last 10 years. That's a version of the teleological argument, which means the argument for design. The fact that I see design in nature tells me something must have designed it. And that's a very hot issue right now. And again, you'll hear it from Richard Dawkins from Cambridge, who hates it with every ounce of his being. He's probably the best known atheist in the world. And yet you'll see little kids be able to reason their way through that one. So it's a good argument. You'll enjoy it. The next one is the problem of evil and miracles. Two different issues there, but very important. You find a sizable group of people don't care what you say because they just cannot believe in the possibility of miracles. A sad thing is that some of these people even call themselves Christians, which is rather unique. But when you get around a lot of liberal people that call themselves liberal Christians, you find out they're Christians in the name, but it doesn't really seem to mean much. So they have some particular arguments that they're going to throw out. And most of them come from a guy named David Hume. Probably never heard of David Hume. He was a Scottish skeptic about 2 centuries ago. But Hume is really the father of modern science in some ways. Not in the sense that he was a scientist, he wasn't. But in this radical skepticism against anything miraculous. And so you hear a lot of people say that, it's already been proven miracles are impossible. That's really an echo of Hume. And some people will take that seriously. Evolution, creation, on March 19th. Religious pluralism. We could spend a whole class on religious pluralism. What is religious pluralism? It's the belief that all religions are really different parts of the same thing. Like you might hear people give the story, kind of Oprah Winfrey land here, but this is actually very old, 3,000 plus years old. Religion is like different blind people circling an elephant, and each person has a different part of the elephant they're touching. And all of them think that the elephant is what they're touching, as opposed to what somebody else is touching. But at the end, the wise person recognizes the moral of the story. They're all touching the same thing. So aren't all religions really the same thing as expressed through different cultures and different languages? Isn't God and Krishna and Allah and Jehovah, aren't these all names for the exact same thing? What's the big deal? Why do we get hung up on details? Why should I believe your particular version? Because it's all really the same thing. That is hot. I would argue that's not only most non-Christians I talk to anymore, but half the Christians I know. It's amazing how many Christians I talk to who are very comfortable saying something like, well, I believe Jesus is my Lord, but I don't want to say that has to be for somebody else. Maybe they come to the same thing through Buddha or through Muhammad. And that's from Christian professors in colleges and seminaries. So we live in very pluralistic times. It's very American to be a pluralist. It's very American to say all roads lead to the same place. All religions are like different spokes on the wheel, which all lead to the same place, the same hub. That's our culture. And so by saying that I think Jesus is the only way, whoa, you've become the worst person on the planet. You're bad dinner company. You're a problem at work. Whatever you are, you're the problem child now. How dare you say your way is the only way? I can't tell you how many times I've had that screamed at me by people who are so upset that I've said Jesus is the only way. I mean, it just lights them up like that. And so in this sense, it's a really critical question, which we will have fun with, because it's not a hard argument. But it's sure popular. And then, why the Bible? Why the Bible? Why not the Bhagavad Gita? Why not the Quran? Why should this Bible be held up? Well, that's an important question your friends will have. Or aren't they all just the same thing? Kind of the version of pluralism. Well, we'll look at why we should believe the Bible as opposed to the other texts. And then the last one, the resurrection of Jesus as an actual physical event. Because this is the heart of the faith. If Jesus doesn't resurrect, we're not here. It's real simple. And our faith means nothing. Now, about 180 years ago, a very popular philosopher, who was a Christian, by the way, named Soren Kierkegaard, was reacting to philosophical trends in his day. And Kierkegaard came out and said, you know what, you cannot base your faith on a single historical event. Which, for 1,800 years, most Christians had no problem, because as Paul says quite clearly, if the resurrection did not take place, we are the biggest fools of all. And Kierkegaard tries to walk away from that. If you want to see where liberal Christianity comes out of, you can look right about that same period of time. Kierkegaard affirmed the physical resurrection, by the way, but many people who followed him just took his logic to the next possible, the next step and said, hey, look, faith is one thing, reason and evidence is a whole other thing. It doesn't matter whether there's any evidence for Christianity. I have faith, and I just jump over, he uses illustration, I just jump over this ditch. And that's what real faith is. And faith is not connected to evidence, and faith is not connected to any reason or rationality at all. And this was an enormous divorce for which we are all suffering. There's reasons why people bark at the moon and roar like lions in our churches these days. It's because faith and reason have become enemies. And faith and reason have never been enemies in the history of the church. It's only in the last 150 years, and primarily here in the United States, that this has happened. And again, there's historical reasons. We'll go into a little detail of where that came from, but I'm going to try to make the best case I can that faith and reason are two of the things that God gave us as tools. He tells us to love Him with our heart, soul, mind, and strength. Never does the Bible tell us to put our brain on hold. In fact, I already mentioned to you how I thought Christians thought. Let me just give you a little twist in my own personal history about this. Again, I thought Christians were idiots I'd become a Christian. I pretty much was resigned myself to, I guess I have to, check my brain somewhere. Then my youth pastor gives me a copy of a book by Francis Schaeffer, who was a very important Christian thinker. I had no idea who he was, but he was deep. And I couldn't just put him away. I had to reread some paragraphs. Wait a second, this guy's saying something. And it started opening me up to the fact that Christians weren't all idiots. And especially as I read more Schaeffer, I started to find out about some of the most important scientists and some of the most important philosophers who have ever lived were in fact Christians. Never heard any of that before. Isaac Newton was a Christian? That wasn't told to me in my science classes. Michael Faraday, Francis Bacon, all these people were Christians. Never heard that. Important philosophers like Anselm and Augustine and Kant, sort of. All sorts of people were in fact Christians. Kierkegaard was a Christian. Never heard that either. In other words, the big burst of my, preconception about Christianity occurred when I realized that, hey, God doesn't intend for you to check your brain. In fact, as I just read you that one verse, God commands us to use our mind. Now, the irony is here, 20 years after that, I become a missionary, and I'm dealing mainly with New Age folk at the time, in the early 90s. And I'm going to psychic fairs and all sorts of other fun places, and I'm being told by them that I think way too much. And as I started reading a lot more Hindu and Buddhist literature, I started realizing why they're saying this. Because the Hindus and the Buddhists have been attacking the mind for at least 2,500 years. The mind is the impediment to enlightenment. You must get your mind out of the way by doing mindless meditation or drugs if you want to experience the true oneness of the universe. And all of a sudden I started to realize why it's so critical that God tells me to love Him with my mind. And I always tell, when I do this for youth groups, I always tell them, hey, look, as soon as somebody says you need to, meditate and let your mind go away and somehow put your mind on the shelf, as soon as I hear it, because Christians are saying this too sometimes, I tell kids, look, there ought to be a red flag going up, warning, 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 garbage coming in. Because the only reason anybody tells you to check your brain at the door is when they're trying to give you something that makes no sense. They're going to tell you 2 + 2 = 5. And if I stood in front of you and said 2 + 2 = 5, you'd say, get this moron out of here, and rightly so. But for some reason, if I stand here dressed as a guru or as a great wise religious leader of some other tradition, and I intone it very profoundly, 2 + 2 is 5. For some reason, this lunacy becomes a higher and more profound truth, and you'll buy it. And it happens to brilliant people. I meet PhDs who basically say 2 + 2 = 5. So this tells me a lot. The enemy's in the business of attacking the mind. And God is in the business of affirming our mind, commanding us to think and think well. And I think part of what you do when you get into the practice of apologetics as part of the mission endeavor is that you recognize that. Maybe doubts you have in your own mind. I mean, there's 2 reasons why we don't witness to people, I think. Number 1 is we're just afraid. Maybe you're naturally shy, whatever. Or intimidated or whatever it is. But I think for a lot of us, there's a corollary reason, and that is that we're terrified out there is a smoking gun we haven't run into yet. And it's going to lay your faith, to waste. And so if I just avoid these conversations, I never get in trouble, and I can always just have my faith off in my little private corner of my life where it won't threaten anybody, nor will I be threatened. I think part of what happens with apologetics is you become bolder. Why do you become bolder? Because you're a lot more confident. Guys, if you were to come to my library in my house, I've got about every religion and philosophy you can think of all in one large room. And I don't see the smoking guns. I was not raised a Christian. I'm not interested in being a Christian because it's fashionable or anything like that. I believe it because it's true. I think we can make the case in all sorts of ways, and that's what we're going to be doing in this class. And the more you start to think that through, that you get emboldened. You start to go, hey, I don't have to be afraid of, my really bright neighbor down the street or my brother who's always trying to intimidate with his college degrees or whatever. After a while, it's not that hard to deal with some of these arguments. In fact, most of them, not all, most of them after a while you're going to say, how did I ever fall for that? Because it wasn't hard to deal with. And I shouldn't have been intimidated. So part of what we're trying to do with this class is break down some big words and some big ideas and make them bite-sized chunks that make sense to you so that you can turn that around and engage with people. If you're just doing this for knowledge's sake or because you just want to one-up your friends in a trivia game someday, you're wasting your time. You really are. But if you're really interested in sharing your faith with somebody, This class will help. And as a byproduct, your faith will grow stronger, which will embolden you, which will help you. It's this wonderful circle once you're into it. You really learn after a while I don't have to be afraid anymore. There's nothing I'm going to hear that, in fact, after a while, you do this enough and you say, it's the same old thing. It's the exact same old line. Already been through this fight. Don't have to worry about it anymore. And you'll be a lot more confident for that. So that's kind of the basic breakdown of the class. Like I said, you have a lot of wonderful links that you can dig up and find some wonderful articles. My suggestion to you is download the articles, print them out, and keep them. Keeping them in a file. Again, read them at your leisure when you've got some time. But it's a lot more profitable than reality TV. Okay, you will learn a lot. You will grow a lot through the exercise here. So that's my suggestion to you. Any questions about this so far before we get into the first part of this? Nobody? It was so concise. That's great. I don't believe it. Unfortunately, we have to do a little philosophical legwork here for a minute. Because I want to bore you with a philosophy class? No, I know if I put history of philosophy up here, none of you would be here probably. Or maybe there's a real sick, twisted individual that might have wanted to come. But as I said before, ideas affects the culture. And I always tell people, I'm in the PhD program at DU, I've been there several years now. People want to pretend that all religions really teach the same thing. And so I will often ask people who say something like that, I said, do you really think that it made a difference what those people in 9/11 believed when they were driving planes into buildings? Do you think it matters to them that you think all religions really teach basically the same thing? Just something to get them to think a little bit. It's obvious to them that those ideas that they held on to mattered a lot to them. And whether we liked it or not, they mattered a lot to us. 3,000 people dying because of it. All of a sudden we realize, hey, there's some really bad ideas out there. Only have lots of people in our culture say, well, they're not bad ideas because we don't believe in bad anymore. What a fun world we live in. We have to unpack this a little bit for you to understand why this is coming up. Why do you hear after 9/11 Stanley Fish from Duke and all sorts of other very prominent professors saying that what happened on 9/11 was not bad, it was not evil. Just a different perspective. Whoa. You've got to be kidding me, right? No. This is what's being shoved down our university students' throats for about 10 years now. And so I want you to understand that because it is, in many ways, it's not as popular as they want to make it out to be. I always tell people, if you want to see postmodernism, go to the university and MTV. That's the two best spots. Most people don't live that way. Car mechanics don't operate on this basis. Mechanical engineers don't live on the basis. And if you're baking a cake and you're a postmodern, I do not want to touch your cake. I don't want to get anywhere near anything you bake on the basis that there's no such thing as truth. Okay? Well, a little arsenic, a little whatever, it doesn't matter. So let's break this down. And I'm not going to go through the whole history, but what a lot of people are saying pre-modern is all the way up to the 1600s. So this would include Christians, to the history of the church up through Luther and Calvin. Now, in many ways, this discussion is about a big word here called epistemology. Don't get upset when I use big words because I'm going to explain every one of them. Epistemology is the question of how do we know what we know. Do I know things because I see them and touch them and hear them? Do I know things because I can reason them out? Do I know things because God has revealed it to us? Or perhaps the devil has deceived us? How do I know what I know? It's because the church told me so? Or mom and dad? That's what epistemology is about. How do we know what we know? And so in a lot of ways, this whole discussion here that I'm going to give you is about this question. All right? For the pre-modern, you had a dispute in Western, and we're dealing primarily with the Western world. For most of the last 1,000 years, you had people who believed in miracles. No problem. Of course, the ancient world believed in miracles. Took it easily. That wasn't a big argument. You don't see a lot of people arguing in the 6th century or the 12th century about whether there's miracles or not. They just accepted it for granted. The big dispute was the authority question. Is it the church? Well, by medieval Catholicism, by the 11th, 12th, 13th century, most Europeans thought authority, knowledge, how we know what we know, is handed down to the vicar of Christ and the magisterium. In other words, the Pope and the authority of the Catholic Church. That's how we know what we know. Now, you still have people out there in the pre-modern world, whether it's Plato, Aristotle, or a zillion other philosophers that follow, arguing about rationality versus empiricism. In other words, hands-on facts versus rational thinking, rational argumentation. You'll still have that discussion going on in the background, but part of what's driving all of this is that's a background issue at this point. What's really the issue for the church is the authority of the church. With Luther and Calvin comes the Protestant Reformation, and the authority question gets thrown up in the air. Now it's no longer the church, it's the scriptures. But the church and Luther are not arguing about miracles. They both believe in miracles, took it for granted. It's in the Bible. It's what the church has always taught. Either way you saw it, the church believed in miracles. It becomes an internal discussion in the Western world about church authority versus, if you take Luther's famous statements, if you can show me any of my books where I'm wrong according to the Bible, I will change them immediately. The Word of God was the issue for Luther. And I won't say it as rudely as Luther did, but Luther had this thing about the blank, fill in the blank later, goddess reason. Rhymes with which, goddess reason, is the way Luther said this. And what he was talking about was a group of skeptics out there who were attacking the Bible based on sheer reason. If you care less what the Bible said, we're under its authority. But it was a very minority point of view. You can see it's become a much bigger point of view. So, again, this is really fast, and we're glossing over a lot of stuff, but that's kind of what the pre-modern world is. The modern world is sometimes called the Enlightenment. And there's several names, but I'm just going to give you 3 that are real critical. The first one is René Descartes, who lives in the early 1600s, French Catholic, helped develop the calculus, brilliant thinker. Did a lot of philosophy as well as did a lot of physics and mathematician. Well, as a mathematician, he was very interested in making things down to the last decimal point. He was very meticulous in his way of approaching things. And for Descartes, he becomes the father of rationalism, modern rationalism. In other words, the epistemology question for Descartes was settled in this way. I don't care about what my eyes might see. I don't care about what I might touch or smell. I know that my senses can be fooled. And Descartes actually used an old famous illustration. Most of you have even tried this. He says, you could take a pencil or a straight stick and you hold it under the water and it appears to bend. So my eyes are telling me that stick's bending. Yet I know when I pull the stick out again, it's still straight. That's Descartes' way of saying you can't trust your senses. Your senses can be too easily fooled. Anybody that's been to a good magic show knows how easy it is to be fooled. If you've ever got a chance to see, a lot of the top magicians are Christians, but if you ever get a chance to see Andre Cole, you should really go before he retires. He's been traveling with Campus Crusade for about 40 years now. And I've seen his show twice and sponsored it once in Nebraska when I was a youth pastor. And I have people coming out of there, it's all of the demons, and no, it's not. It's just tricks. There's reasons why there's curtains up there and you can't see it behind. But what you see is impressive, and you don't know how it's done. My oldest son, who's 25 now, was about 8. And him and the other pastor that I was working with to sponsor this event, he had them come up on the stage, and he put 2 basically spigots on their heads, and he just turned them on. And water just kept pouring and pouring and pouring. And we're all just sitting there, all right, what the heck is he doing? And that was just a simple one. The point is, as Cole illustrates and Descartes really believed, it is not that hard even to fool our senses. We can be fooled in all sorts of things. I met a Satanist one time who had an entire theology built out of his LSD experiences. He was convinced, he had seen it with his eyes, and this is how he told me, that people could walk along and rip other people's souls out of their body. He was terrified of people because of this. Soul vampires, something like that. And he did this he saw this while he was experiencing, the side effects of LSD. Descartes would look at that kind of thing as another example. Hey, guys, let's multiply examples by the thousands. You cannot trust your sense experience. So what can you trust? A rational mind. In fact, Descartes cheats on this. He basically says, God gave us a rational mind, and God would not allow us to be deceived. Descartes had this fear, and he expressed it this way. I may think I'm arguing rationally or I'm experiencing something, but suppose I'm just, I'm just a brain in a vat, in some cave, and some evil demon is tickling me with a feather, tickling my brain and making me think different weird thoughts. Again, this is what philosophers do when they have way too much time in their hands, so don't get lost on this. But he would actually speculate about that. How do I know that I'm experiencing the right thing? And he basically says, well, I just have to take seriously that God will not allow me to be fooled, which is an interesting thought in itself. But he came up with this famous phrase, cognita ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, which most of you have heard. And let me tell you where that came from. That is a phrase basically saying, all right, I want to get to the bottom of all knowledge. How do we start? And he says, well, I'm just going to start doubting everything. I'm going to doubt that everything in the world exists. But the one thing I cannot doubt is my own existence. For when I'm doubting my own existence, there has to be a doubter there. Somebody must be doing the doubting for the doubt to exist. So even though I can deny all of you exist, I can't deny that I exist. Now, understand that he's saying this not in a vacuum, but in a culture where there's a long-standing argument way back that goes all the way back to Plato, which was at that point 2,000 years earlier, about whether we're actually here or not, whether this world is real. And when you get into the Hindu and Buddhist world, that's absolute dogma. The world is not real. It does not exist. And if you watch the movie The Matrix, you get a very nice little computer analogy for what Hindus and Buddhists have always believed. The world doesn't exist. It's a dream. God fell asleep and had a dream, and that's what we all exist in. So there's a westernized version of that Descartes really wrestling with. So again, he says, I can doubt your existence, but I can't doubt my own. For even to doubt means there's somebody doubter. There must be a doubter. So when I think, it proves my existence. Cognita ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. So he's basically got this whole argument for rationalism. And in his hubris, and this is where he made his major mistake, Descartes argued that he can actually reason his way all the way back to God. I can show the existence of God through theorems and proofs, just through my naked reason alone. I don't need, if you listen carefully, what is he saying? I don't really need the Bible. I don't even need the authority of the church. See how radical a step this is? I'm not denying that God exists. I'm just saying I can know him without any aids at all. Very radical step. Now, about 100 years later, there's a reaction to this. There was already little reactions, but in a big-time way, and that's David Hume. And as you're going to see how different these guys are and how different they think, when you hear postmoderns talk about how all modern people think this way, you're going to start to look at them funny and go, what the heck are you saying? They don't think alike at all, but we'll get to that. Hume's reacting to all this, and he's reacting to the Catholic versions of the arguments we're going to give you later on in our time in school and ministry, like the teleological argument, the cosmological argument. These were arguments that the Aquinas and other Catholic writers had spent a lot of time and a lot of space writing about. You go touch a Jesuit priest today and say, give me the 5 arguments for God, and it'll just come out like that because this is so basic to Catholic thought. It's how you give the arguments for God. And Hume is reacting to all of that as well as Descartes. And Hume is saying, I can reason I can create all sorts of fun things in my mind. I can imagine an island out there and fill it in with all sorts of details. The only problem is it doesn't exist. How do I gain knowledge from something that doesn't exist? So Hume's going to go the exact opposite way. I can't learn from reason. I must have something more basic to that. And so he becomes the father of empiricism. And empiricism is the idea that all that we know comes to us through sense data. What I see, what I taste, what I touch. Welcome to modern science in the hardest version of this. So I don't know through rationality. I only know because I can grab it and I can touch it. And so if you think that through for a minute, see how opposite he is of Descartes. Since I can't grab and touch your God, it doesn't have any real existence, does it? And that kind of arguments come around to this day. You'll talk this out with your friends, your family members, something like that. Well, where's God? Show me. Come on. Where's his footprints? Let's see it. That's basically an echo of Hume. So Hume's argument is the exact opposite. One says you know everything through rationality. The other one says you know everything through sense data. Okay, see, you can't get any farther apart in these fellows. And philosophers lined up on both sides. And, oh, by the way, Christian thinkers lined up on both sides as well. You have Christian thinkers like Bishop Berkeley, who was an English bishop, who basically said, we're nothing but thoughts in God's mind. We don't have any reality at all. Bishop Berkeley was a rather strange guy, but brilliant in a weird way, but nobody takes him seriously. But all I'm saying is you can see the thinkers in Europe dividing up. And then in the late 1700s comes a different guy, Immanuel Kant. And Kant kind of turns the world upside down. And is affected, even though, if you've heard the word, if you've taken a bit of him in a class, I don't think anybody's affected the world as much in the last, maybe Marx. But Kant affected Marx. Kant affected everybody. And it affects us as Christians. And not to our good, by the way. Kant is saying, here I am, a good little Lutheran Christian in my little town in Königsberg, and I'm teaching a little university here, and I run into David Hume. And I start reading, not physically, but he's reading some of Hume's books. And Hume just slaps him in the face. And Kant realizes, hey, I can't think the way I used to think. Hume has unsettled me too much. I've got to think differently. So what Kant is going to try to do is put these two together. Try to synthesize these two completely opposite points of view. So let's look at what he did here. By the way, if you're really a masochist of sorts and you want to torture yourself, just pick up Kant's Critique of Pure Reason or something. You'll hate yourself for the rest of your life. I'm going to summarize what he did. Idealism is an old word in philosophy. It goes back to Plato. Anybody ever heard Plato's story of the cave? Some of you might have got that in school. Nobody heard the cave story? It's this famous story called The Cave in this book, The Republic. And in the cave, people in the cave are tied to chairs and they can't get up. And as they're looking forward, they see shadows on the wall. And behind them there's a fire. And beyond the fire is people doing things. But since I'm tied to the chair in one particular direction, all I see is the images of the shadows. And Plato says that's who we are in this world. We're caught by our historical situation. We're caught looking at the world like this, but all we're getting is play acting, pantomimes on the wall there. We're not really touching the real thing. The real thing's somewhere else. And this is called idealism as opposed to realism, which this actually is here. And so there's been different versions of idealism. Kant is a type of idealist. In some ways, the world is here, but we don't experience it. I'm not really touching this in any real sense. I'm only touching it artificially, in a very limited way. And he made a distinction between two things. And one of those is phenomena. And the other one is noumena. Again, if you don't understand, it's very okay to raise your hand and say, what the heck? Phenomena is the things we see, we touch, we measure, we taste. For Kant, this is Hume's world. This is where science gets saved. If you take Hume seriously, and the way my professor at CU said it like this, Hume destroyed science. This is what's funny about Hume being the fair-haired boy of science today. Hume destroyed science. Hume attacked cause and effect. There is no such thing as cause and effect. Well, imagine science without cause and effect. What's the point of doing anything? And it was really Kant that comes along later and saves cause and effect from Hume. But anyways, Kant throws something for Hume's way. He talks about the world of phenomena. That's the world we actually live in. The world of appearance and things. However, we never get to the real thing. Kant had this way of saying the thing in itself. And this is where he sounds a little bit like Plato. We're only grasping the form of something, the shadow of it. We're never really getting to the real thing. And some Christians say, well, that real thing's in the mind of God. There's some Christian Platonists that take Plato seriously. But Kant says we never touch the real thing. But what's happening as I appear to be touching this pen is that my mind's doing all this incredible work. My mind is constructing and putting together sense data, so I touch this. My mind is putting all that together, and it's also sorting it out. So categories like time and space, that I can see a distinction between these two objects and a relative space, say a foot between them, and things like this. That's my mind's job. My mind is constantly constructing because that's the way God made it. That's how Kant argued. Kant gave us categories, and our mind is just, it's like furniture in your brain. Your brain just automatically sorts out all the data you get. All right, so I bring in new data, I see the sunlight in the morning or something like that. My mind is already ahead of that, constructing my reaction. All right, so that's a bit of it. The noumena is the thing I never really touch. Now, Kant's famous line was, I have limited reason to make room for faith. All those words. The world of reason and the world of faith become two separate worlds altogether. Like I said, this is why you have people barking at the moon in church, or laughing like hyenas, or roaring like lions and stuff. Because faith and reason became enemies. And Kant's really the first one who did this. So for Kant, the real world is beyond our sense experience. That would include things like God and spirits and all sorts of other objects of faith. So in essence, you could believe there's pink elephants dancing on the dark side of the moon. For Kant, that would be okay. All right, as long as you didn't try to say they were in the world of phenomena. Now, you will also hear scientists and critics of the Bible sometimes talk like this. Well, look, scientists have their game and religious people have their game. As long as the two don't get together, we're okay. I don't care what the religious people say as long as they don't enter my world and try to tell me what goes on in my test tube. That's Kant. Just an echo of him 200 years after the fact. So what happens is faith and reason become enemies. And this just takes Europe by storm. And again, it was seen on a par by Enlightenment thinkers. It has the same effect on the culture as what Copernicus did when he basically said, hey, you know what, the Earth's not the center of the universe. And the Earth is revolving around the sun, not vice versa. And Copernicus upset a lot of apples with that one, and Kant upsets all sorts of people's apples with this. He's trying to put both Hume and Descartes together, but he really creates this whole new thing. Now, what happens here? Why does it matter to you and me? It's how people react to this that matters so much to us. Within 20 years of his death, you have a very famous Christian named Schleiermacher. I'll say churchman named Schleiermacher. Good Lutheran fellow who's tired of hanging around universities and hearing people mock Christianity. And so he has to react to that, and he reacts to Kant and say, well, Kant has helped me here. In fact, the way Schleiermacher said, he has this famous phrase for it. He goes, I want to rescue Christianity from its cultured despisers. In other words, educated people, artists, musicians, philosophers, others who are poking fun of my faith. Cultured despisers. How do I rescue Christianity from that? Well, Christianity is not about facts like the resurrection, like the crossing of the Red Sea, like the creation of the garden, and like all these miraculous stories. I mean, that was fine for fishermen and farmers, but who could take that seriously today? In the 1800s, we're so much wiser than those people now. So Christianity doesn't deal with this world. Not one single bit. You talk to friends in United Methodists, United Church of Christ, a whole lot of liberal denominations, and they will call themselves Christians, but they don't believe in miracles, they don't believe in the resurrection or anything like that. Welcome to this. Schleiermacher is the father of modern liberalism, or modern liberal Christianity. So if you might ask Schleiermacher, well, what is Christianity then? Well, he says it's a feeling of dependence. When I look up at the mountains and I look up in the universe and I feel very small, and I realize there must be something bigger than us all, that must be God. It's purely subjective, and it's purely a feeling. It has nothing to do with rationality. It has nothing to do with evidence or facts. All this stuff about Christians proving the resurrection and all these kind of things, that's this world. We can't play in that world anymore. Kant separated the two. So Schleiermacher reacts to this. Within another 10 years, you have different reactions. You have Kierkegaard, who I mentioned earlier, who makes, as a Christian now, and I would say a much more profound Christian Schleiermacher wasn't, but he at least went to church. Kierkegaard was a very profound Christian, and you can gain a lot of things from reading him, but he's basically reacting to this pendulum swing from another guy named Hegel. Hegel also was a good churchman and a very arrogant jerk. But Hegel was a big fan of people like Napoleon and all these others, and who was running through the countryside throughout all this time. And Hegel said, you want to see God? Look in the world. And he called it the Weltgeist, the world spirit. That's God. God is working through history. If you can't understand Marx, if you don't understand Hegel, Marx was a student of Hegel's. And all Marx did was pull God out of the equation. But for Hegel, God was in the world, moving through the world. He was a pantheist of sorts. He really believed God was in nature and in world history. So you want to see God at work? Look at Napoleon or other great people like that. That was God at his finest. And some people might say, well, what about the tens of thousands that are dying almost every day in these wars, in the Napoleonic wars that are raging all across Europe at this point? And Hegel's response, it's kind of similar to, well, to make an omelet, you have to break a few eggs. And Hegel basically responded by saying something like that. It doesn't matter because God is working throughout the world. And so what if people die? And Kierkegaard listened to all that. And we go to the same lectures and listen to Hegel speak. And he goes, wait a second. I don't know about the death of millions, but my death seems to matter to me. And he founds what's called existentialism, which is basically taking philosophy and putting it on its ear a little bit. Philosophy has been concerned about forms and ideals, some of the stuff I mentioned from Plato. And Kierkegaard says, before you ever get to that, what your role in his life and all this kind of stuff, the first primary thing about philosophy is to deal with the fact that you exist. You're an existing creature. And because of that, you are a subjective creature. Now, this is going to haunt us later on, and I'll get to why. In other words, for Kierkegaard, and again, he's reacting against Hegel. I don't think he would think it through this way if he were to think it through better today. Truth is subjective. Truth is not something out there in the world that doesn't have anything to do with you. That was Hegel in Kierkegaard's mind. What truth is running rampant through the countryside with Napoleon. No. For Kierkegaard, truth is here, inside me. Now, I'll give you an illustration that most of you will appreciate. He's a Danish Lutheran. He says, so let me see, what does it take to be born and raised a Christian? What does it take to follow Jesus? I'm born, I get baptized, and there's a list of doctrines on the wall that I have to sign off on. Is that all? Is that all it means to be a Christian? Shouldn't there be some commitment, some passion, some throwing myself in God's arms and asking for his help and depending on him and all language that most of us would read and go, yeah, I can relate to that. I grew up in a dead church where nothing was really asked of me, and you just fill in the blanks and you stand up, sit down, fight, and that's all it means to be a Christian. And Kierkegaard's reacting to all that state stuff. So he comes back, and like I said, part of this is true. In some ways, truth is subjective. It's subjective as to whether or not I like the Yankees or am a truly evil person and like the Red Sox. That's a subjective choice. It's not necessarily based on hard data. Why you might like vanilla ice cream instead of Rocky Road or something like that. Those things are subjective. The problem is when people today want to argue that there's no difference between what ice cream flavor and whether abortion's right or wrong. That those are just two different types of questions, but they're all the same question. It's just your choice. Hey, who are you to push your morality down my throat? You just say your morality is right and mine's wrong. You ever heard that before? If you talk to anybody about what's right or wrong or about your faith, you will run into that discussion. So Kierkegaard is arguing half right that truth is subjective. And I'm going to say sometimes it is, but he doesn't say that. He says all truth is subjective, which was his mistake. So, anyways, Kant just sets the whole table up this way. Within 100 years, the guy that I'm writing my dissertation on reacts to all of this slightly different. And he becomes the grandfather of postmodernism, so I'm trying to trace it to today. And this is Friedrich Nietzsche. I'll put him up here. And Nietzsche, son of a pastor, grandson of a pastor, father dies when he's 5. His young brother dies at 2. Both of this happened within a short time. Nietzsche, I believe, was dramatically affected by the problem of evil. Two very important people in his life. are dead. He's basically raised by women. He has this long, till the day he dies, hatred of women, except for his sister, who was a personal friend of Adolf Hitler. It's interesting how the world works, guys. Small world sometimes. Nietzsche reacts to all of this. He leaves Christianity, starts reading liberal Christian stuff, realizes for him the Bible's just a fairy tale book, and starts reading Buddhism and all this kind of fun stuff. He's getting into Asian religion. Most importantly, Nietzsche comes up with a series of ideas, 1, 2, 3, that have really affected us. First is God is dead. And Nietzsche's an atheist. He doesn't believe that there's a God who actually died. In fact, my last newsletter, if you go on our website, you'll see that I go into this a little bit of detail. It doesn't say that there's a God out there and one day God croaked. He's not saying that at all. Nietzsche's saying the idea of God that has held the Western world together, be it Catholic or Protestant or Greek Orthodox, it doesn't matter. Virtually all the Western world is held on to this belief in God. And this word, God, is packed full of meaning. We get our values, our ethics. We get our epistemology. So much of what we've always thought as Western people for 2,000 years is centered around this word God. Only what's happened in the last 60 or 70 years has changed everything. Now, what happens between Kierkegaard in the 1830s and 1840s and Nietzsche in the 1870s? Well, one thing that happened was Darwin. 1859 publishes The Origin of Species. Boy, has this turned the world on its head. God doesn't have a job in creation anymore. Don't need him. In fact, as Nietzsche's pointing out, Nietzsche's a big fan of Darwin. He used to write letters to him and all this, and he would write letters to Marx, who was also a big fan of Darwin. One of the things that Nietzsche points out is that it's you Christians who killed God. So the first one is God is dead. Second, we have killed him. It is Western European Christianity that killed God. Not me. I'm just the messenger boy. That was Nietzsche's way of saying this. I didn't kill anybody. I don't believe in that in the first place. You Christians are the ones who took God off the throne. He has this kind of poetic way of saying this. He says, which one of us had a sponge who could wipe the whole sky clean? A very famous Nietzschean way of saying it. We're the ones who got rid of God. And since God is dead, there's no such thing as good and evil. So first, God is dead. Secondly, we have killed him. Third, there is no such thing as good and evil. Now, what did he mean by that? Well, pretty simple. It's God who provides ethics and values for Western society. You can't look at English law, American law, French law. You cannot look anywhere in the Western world without seeing the influence of the Bible. You have people trying to deny that today, but it's overwhelmingly historical how much influence the Bible has on Western culture. Nietzsche certainly saw it, despised it, hated it. But his point is that once you take God out, you don't have a transcendent point of view. Remember Kant, I called it transcendental idealism? Kant says God's up there and he creates our minds in a certain way, and he must be necessary for there to be morality. You can't have morality, universal absolutes, ethics, that it's always wrong to murder, that it's always wrong to steal, that it's always wrong to rape. You can't have those things without God. And even some atheists have admitted that point. In fact, they admit it in droves in some places. So for Kant, you had to have God's existence at hand to make morality work. Well, Nietzsche just comes along and says, wait a second. It's not me. You guys are the ones who don't believe in God anymore. Because the seminaries after Kant in Germany, where there were more seminaries and Bible colleges, especially seminaries, than anywhere else in the world. Germany, for 150 years, was the most educated people on the planet. They had more universities and schools than anybody else, and they had more seminaries than anywhere else. And it's the heartbeat of the Reformation, and there's all these... At that time, the theology departments and the seminaries and the universities were tied together. They weren't separate animals like they are today. And so it would be very routine for a professor to teach philosophy one day and theology the next. Well, what's happened since Kant? Faith and reason are now enemies. So I go into my class and I teach Darwin, and then I go into my class on theology the next day and I teach Christianity, but it's a different sort of Christianity. It's not Christianity about what actually happened and whether you take these miracles and here's how you can prove the case for the miracle. It's instead a Christianity where you can, how you can believe in Christianity without believing in all those stupid miracles. And it's the same guy teaching this in many cases. So Nietzsche's writing this after seeing this go on in the seminaries for 40 years, 50 years at this point, and saying, you guys are the ones who threw out God, not me. I'm just the messenger boy coming along and pointing out what you've already done. Look at your seminaries. And this is true in the Jewish seminaries in Germany as well. You can be a complete atheist and be a Jew by the mid-1800s in Germany. They didn't see a disconnect at all. So Nietzsche's just writing this. Once you get rid of this God's eye view, the one transcendent thing out there, remember for Kant, transcendental idealism. There's a God out there helping us sort everything out. Nietzsche just says, once you realize there's no God out there, there never was, then guess what you have left? Remember, epistemology is the heart of all this? How do we know? All you have is perspective. Every one of us has our own perspective. And nobody's perspective is any better than anybody else's. Now we're starting to get into the postmodern mindset. For Kierkegaard, everything was subjective. For Nietzsche, similar thought, everything is just a perspective. So you're a Christian and I'm a Buddhist. Well, who's to say your Christianity is any better than my Buddhism? Just your perspective as opposed to my perspective. And since neither of us have a perch or somebody up on a perch to see the truth about everything, then all we're left with is opinions and interpretations. Nietzsche has this very famous way of saying this, that all claims to truth are just rolling armies of metaphors. That's all they are. We're just giving metaphors and we act like they're facts, but they're not. They're just interpretations built on other interpretations, built on other interpretations, just a house of cards of interpretations, and nobody's interpretation is any more valid than anybody else's. We're really starting to get into the postmodern world. And Nietzsche was a very dark soul. He realized that what happens when you take, and he has this thing that's almost prophetic, when you take God out, since God had provided our values and everything else, all you have is nothing. And he used an old Greek word, nihilism. All our values, all our ethics, empty, nothing there. There's no value to life anymore. There's no meaning to anything. And so he says, well, what do you do with this? Well, there's going to be a real struggle for Europe. And he actually, in my mind, it's like he's predicting World War I and II. Because he talks about this great struggle that will come before somebody applies meaning. I only found this out 2 weeks ago. I studied Nietzsche a long time, but most of the German soldiers in World War I, virtually every belt buckle in the army had God with us on their belt buckle. And almost all the soldiers had a Bible, and they also had a copy of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. That's the part I did not know, which is one of Nietzsche's most famous books. And it's where this whole play comes out about there's no such thing as God, God is dead. So what happens for Nietzsche? Well, he says what's going to happen is there'll have to be an Ubermensch, a Superman, an Overman, somebody bigger who by his mere strength of will force his own values on everybody else. Do you start to get a hint of why Hitler liked this guy? There's some argument among scholars about whether this was a proper application, but Nietzsche's sister was personal friends. When she died, there was a state funeral for her in Berlin. Very closely connected. And anyways, you see there's more connections as that. Well, so Nietzsche basically, in some ways, sets the table for what it looks like without God. Now, the next guy, now we're getting into the postmodern thing, is another German. And truly the worst guy I ever read other than Kant. And that's Martin Heidegger. And he wrote this monstrous book called Being and Time. I don't recommend it. Not one single bit. But Heidegger basically gives an interpretation of Nietzsche. Oh, and by the way, Heidegger was a Nazi, was a member of the Nazi Party, taught at the universities which are run by the Nazis. Up until his dying day, which is like 20 years ago, he never once came out and said what happened was wrong. Not once. He's one of the few who just held through that whole thing, true to form for the rest of his life. I have a Jewish friend in my doctoral program that just thinks he walks on water. What a brilliant guy. And I'm like, of all the ironies, because there's pictures of Heidegger in his SS uniform. I mean, it's not even subtle. Well, anyways, Heidegger interprets him and comes out basically the same. No good and evil. And he has this whole thing about resolution to death and all this wild stuff I'm not going to go into. But then what happens for us, just to take us up to today, is a whole group of people most of you never heard of. And you should be thankful in some ways. But unfortunately, your kids who are in high school, they're already affected by these guys. And if they go to university, I guarantee they're affected by these guys. Most of these guys are French. Rorty is an American, was at Harvard for many years. Derrida, Foucault, Lyotard, Rorty, there's a bunch of others. These are the postmoderns. For the most part, these are French Marxists who got disillusioned with Marxism and started studying Heidegger's version of Nietzsche. So here's the grandfather of postmodern, here's the dad, here's the kids. And, well, some of them are dead now, some other ones are running around. They're just going to take the exact ideas I've been running with, already describing to you, and just playing them out. All right, what does this mean? What does it mean to say God is dead? Well, the way it comes to us in schools is the author is dead. Sadly, you can get this at Colorado Christian University. That's a whole other story. What does it mean to say the author is dead? As soon as I wrote this syllabus for y'all, or in this case, tore up my old one and did it badly, as soon as I finished it, I died, metaphorically. Because you guys can never hope to understand what I really meant. So instead of worrying about that, the study of hermeneutics, which is interpretation, if you take a class on biblical hermeneutics, is how to study the Bible. But hermeneutics applies to how you study a cookbook or how you study anything else. If somebody writes a love letter, is it different than reading a printout for making a nuclear bomb? I hope so. But you would apply certain hermeneutics to it, certain ways of understanding it. You don't read poems in the same way you read narrative text. You don't read narrative text in the same way you read a cookbook again. Okay? So the different types of text. And classically, hermeneutics was, well, what was the author trying to say? So many of you grew up in a church. Just think of it this way. You went to a Bible study or you listened to a sermon, and what does the preacher say? Well, what do you think Paul was trying to say here? Or what is Jeremiah's point when he writes this here? We're trying to get in touch with the author. What was the author thinking, right? Every one of you has heard something like that in your life. Well, this whole move says that none of that matters. Jeremiah is dead. Paul is dead. Everyone's dead as soon as they do a text. Or for that matter, it could be a song or a piece of poetry or anything like this. They really try to be ruthlessly consistent. It doesn't matter what the artist, the musician, or the author said, because you can't possibly hope to understand what they really said. All you can understand is what you bring to the table. So another word for this is called reader response theory. And it's just a way of saying, hey, look, I can't hope to begin to even understand what the author said. So I, as a black lesbian witch, bring my own community's understandings to the text and interpret it according to our community and our experience. Welcome to the politically correct university world. All right? Where each group interprets text according not to what the author said, the author's died, but to what I bring to the table. That I can be sure of is what I actually think, how my community believes and thinks. So, literally, you can go to seminaries and universities around the country and find doctoral dissertations being written on why Paul was a homosexual who really changed everything that Jesus wrote and created Christianity as we know it today. You can find dozens of versions of that. It's a very popular theme in the academic world. Well, how do I know that? Well, see, as a practicing homosexual, I bring my reading to the text. It doesn't matter what you guys think the text means. That's just your opinion. That's just your perspective. And I have my perspective. And since my perspective has been disenfranchised and didn't have power throughout history, mine is even more important than yours in the university today. It's like there's a great big pie and there's slices of the pie. And what's favored in the university is the minority players. And my standing joke is, if I was a black lesbian witch, I'd never have to pay a dime for school loans. As it is, my great-grandchildren will be paying off my school loans because I'm not a black lesbian witch. I have the worst of all possible worlds. I'm a white male Christian. And at the university level, I'm just dead meat. You know, I've even joked about with my liberal professors at DU. It's not like they're going to be lining up to hire me anytime soon. I have a young friend I've been mentoring for a while. She is a black philosophy major at the University of Tennessee, Memphis. She will write her own ticket anywhere she wants to go. I guarantee it. Because diversity is so important in so many departments now. To get somebody like her, a black woman, to teach philosophy, they might even overlook that she's a Christian. And if she doesn't tell them, she'll probably get, she'll be the department chair in her first year. She'll get really highly placed because it's so rare to find somebody like her. Well, this is the reason. The world is not about what did the author mean to say. God is dead. There is no transcendent opinion. And as it plays down to our level, the author's dead. It doesn't matter what the author wanted to say. All that matters is what I wanted to say, what I wanted to hear. And we're past our time, so why don't we take our break? And we'll come back and have a little bit more fun with this. We have a very skeptical generation. This is the joys of modernism or postmodernism, is that we have a lot of people who are extremely skeptical about anything true. And that's really where I'm going with this. So, again, the reason we're getting into this discussion is not because I really want to. This is not, and I'll give you a great illustration. Josh McDowell has pointed this out many times. He makes the case that 30 years ago he'd be at the university. And he would make the case for the resurrection. And some student raises his hand, well, where's your evidence for that? How do I know that's true? Was the question. He says today, he'll make a case for the physical resurrection that it's true, and the student will raise his hand and says, how dare you say anything's true? I have been screamed at by people claiming that if you believe in truth, you're just as bad as Adolf Hitler. I'm dead serious. And probably the most famous graduate student educator in the world is a guy named Parker Palmer, claims to be a Christian. He says if you believe in truth, you're the reason for world wars. Maybe you hadn't heard that kind of thing before, but it is all over the place out there. So unfortunately, we had to take the apologetics back one step. Had to walk through the argument about truth or not. And that's why we're doing what we're doing. I'm trying to show you where the assault has come from, and we're going to respond to it as well. But where I was leaving off is we got all these basically failed Marxists who got really disillusioned. Marxism was a meta-narrative. Now, that's just a big word. It means big story. That's all meta-narrative means. One way of looking at the world that explains everything. Christianity is a meta-narrative in that definition. Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, capitalism, sort of, Marxism, definitely. These are all meta-narrative, big stories which help you interpret the world. That's gone. There's no more big stories out there. God is dead. There's nobody above us peons. All right? For Kierkegaard and classic existentialists, which is where most of European philosophers were, what was important to them was the individual. As I mentioned before, my existence is more important than anything else. Postmodernism did a little spin on this. These guys made it about the community. It's your tribe, it's your culture, it's your community. Now, if you take Cultural Anthropology 101 at any university, this is dogma. Every culture's rules are relative to itself. And who are you to say from another culture perspective that culture is wrong? Anybody who's gone through the university has heard this over and over again. And what started off as a revolution in the English lit department snuck over in all sorts of other places, and especially into philosophy and other things like this. So you now have this kind of meltdown of the classic notion of truth. There's no such thing as objectivity. There's nobody standing outside of themselves to see what is true. There's no God standing above us all to see what's true. All you have is your personal interpretations, which were framed by your community, and especially for people like Derrida, by your language. Your language has certain rules. That's the rules you grew up speaking by, and certain ways of understanding anything. And you can't get out of that. For them, language is a prison. And so all you can do is express yourself in certain ways, and others can express themselves, but you're just talking past each other. So you have no right to say that community is wrong for saying X when you're saying non-X. So you think that slavery is wrong, that culture thinks that slavery is right. You have no right to say they're wrong. Why? Because that's a different culture with its own different language game going on. And who are you to say your opinion's any bigger? Do you have a higher perspective? Where does that come from? No more God. All there is our opinions, our perspectives. And these people are ruthless with that. In fact, you find out that the only opinion that seems to be above all ours is French disillusioned Marxists, whose opinion seems to cut all the rest of us down. And I'll show you how that works in just a minute. But this is really where postmodernism came from. Now, they coined another word that's really important, and it's called deconstruction. Just add DE in front of construction, you have the word. What is this all about? Well, when somebody claims to know something or to write something, or worse yet, to say something's true, we're going to look at that text and we're going to take it apart. That's what it means by deconstruction. And we're going to show that this text is the byproduct of a person who lived in a certain place at a certain time, with a certain language, who was influenced by certain cultural elements and events in their life, and therefore that's their take on it. And it's no more valuable than anybody else's take on it, which is why I said the black lesbian witch take on Paul is just as important as any Orthodox Christian, because nobody's closer to the author. The author's gone, nowhere to be found, dead. So all we have is our different community constructions, and each of us construct it. Now, there was a very famous homosexual activist, very popular in many circles, Michel Foucault. And Foucault took it the next step farther. He's a fan of another part of Nietzsche's writings. And Foucault says, anybody who claims to have truth, that's really just a hidden claim for power. When somebody says they have the truth, they're just trying to get power over you in your life. Now imagine what this looks like in a witnessing encounter, where you're trying to share the truth of Jesus Christ. And you quote John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And immediately they're reacting because they hear the T word, which is a new swear word in our modern lexicon, or our postmodern lexicon. You can't say you have the truth anymore. You're trying to get power over me. Christianity is just, and this is a direct quote, religious imperialism. How dare you try to exert power over me and my community? All you have to do is, again, I'm not recommending, but all you have to do is go to any homosexual website, including ones who call themselves Christians, and they will be quoting Michel Foucault all day long, because they believe that what he's saying is it's the truth about, well, wait, there's no truth. Oh, sorry, contradiction. They do that constantly. Foucault claims it's all about power, all right? Richard Rorty at Harvard, Rorty said this very famous thing, truth is whatever my colleagues let me get away with saying. Now, that's profound. I'm glad he was being paid by the Harvard University for how many decades. He literally said that. Basically, he's a pragmatist. By that I mean, true is whatever works for you at any given moment. If adultery works good for you, fine. What's the problem? Who's to say you're wrong? No matter what it is, everything is adjudicated by whatever works for you. So how do you hear that played out in the streets? Well, I'm glad Christianity works for you. And partying works for me, and Buddhism works for my mom. Who are you to say we're wrong? Works for me. All right, that's the critical idea for someone like Rory. Leotard has this other thing. Leotard's more famous quote is something he says, postmoderns are very suspicious of meta-narratives. But you can see this other stuff coming through there. As soon as you start claiming that what you believe is true and other people's point of view is wrong, well, you're a bad person. I'm wondering why you think that way. What makes you think you're any better than anybody else? How dare you say what you believe is right when other people believe are wrong? That's why I said pluralism, which is so hot today, is the direct. I mean, pluralism has been around for a long time, but it has just spread across the country because of these kinds of ideas. So this is just a handful. I don't want to go into great detail on it, but understand this. This is now all over the Christian church to varying degrees in what's called the emerging church. And there's very popular writers like Brian McLaren and Leonard Sweet and other people like this. And I guess 1/5 of the National Pastors Conference this year will be emerging church guys. And there's huge youth pastor sections telling their kids there's no such thing as truth. And isn't it good that there's no such thing as truth? Well, the Bible uses the word true hundreds of times. I guess I got to sort through the Bible differently, don't I? Oh, yeah, that's what they're going to say. So everybody sort of follow me to this point? Don't lie. I still believe in truth, so if you don't... All right, let's respond to some of this silliness. And some of this is so easy that you wonder how anybody could take this seriously, especially the first way we're going to approach it. That's when you realize there's got to be something else going on here, that it's so easy to respond to. You just shouldn't be that way, but I'll explain it to you. So if I write down here, let's take Nietzsche's. Question? Truth is whatever my colleagues will let me get away with. Profound, huh? All truth is perspective. I'm basically summarizing Nietzsche's point of view. Somebody might say, well, everybody's just got opinions. That's all truth is somebody's opinions. That's just a different way of saying this. Anybody got a problem with this? Just look at the words and think about it for a second. What's the problems? I'm sorry? Yeah, but you're cheating. You're going down the line farther. That's true. That comes out of this. I'm just talking about the statement itself. Right. If it is false that all truth is perspective, then who cares about him? But if it's true that all truth is perspectival, who cares about it? Because isn't that just his opinion? Why should I care about it? You know, the most depressed individual that ever lived on this planet, Friedrich Nietzsche. Why should I be bound to his point of view that all truth is perspective? What if my perspective is that, Nietzsche didn't exist? Now what? As soon as you write this on the board, it contradicts itself. It's like saying, there are no such thing as absolutes. And I know that absolutely. Or there is no meaning in a sentence in the English language. Well, as soon as you say it, you've contradicted yourself. There's this Madonna song. Go to great theologians like Madonna, but about 10 years ago, she had this song really reflecting this postmodern stuff. And it had these dervishes, and the dervishes were mystics. It comes out of a version of Sufi Islam. And the total mystics, your mind is a bad thing, and all this kind of stuff. And as they're doing their dervish spinning on the screen, over the top of that, the words of the song is, words have no meaning, especially sentences. Well, obviously, she intended to communicate something, and believes she did, telling us this wonderful new perspective on things, that words have no meaning, especially in sentences. Except she used words in a sentence to express it. So as soon as she said it, she contradicted herself. In philosophy, that's called self-referential incoherence. In other words, as soon as I refer something to itself, there are absolutely no absolutes. As soon as I even say it, it just falls apart. Now, in historic times, if you thought something that's stupid, they would take you out behind the philosophical woodshed and spank you and make you come back with a better idea. Okay? Because it doesn't work. It makes no sense. It contradicts itself right off the bat. As soon as Kierkegaard says all truth is subjectivity, he's doing the same thing. You're just telling me for Kierkegaard and for no one else, it's all subjective. But for Honsberger, it's not. Now what? As soon as you say it, you contradict yourself. So again, the fact that this is so easily spanked tells me something else is going on here. Right? And one of the fun things about what's happened at the university the last, I'd say 25 years especially, is that in all places the mind is being attacked. And that's in the university. Guys, the silliest meeting I've ever gone to was not led by Shirley MacLaine or some New Age type like that. The most inane, irrational meeting I've ever been to was led by professors from MIT. And I came back from that event, and I wrote a paper. I was in CU Boulder's graduate school at the time. And I told my professor, I said, it may be coming a time when the culture has become so irrational that rationality, much like the Middle Ages, the only place you find rationality more is some Christian monastery, because the culture's abandoned it. And like I said, when you see engineers acting like New Age space cadets, you know something's going on, something much deeper. And that's what I think. I think there really is spiritual deception in a large case. And as the Eastern religions take off and postmodern comes in, it's a very unhealthy marriage, because the mind is the problem. Rationality gets in the way. There's a non-Christian book pointing this out that came out 21 years ago, The Closing of the American Mind. Alan Bloom, Jewish professor, taught at Cornell for many years, taught I think at the University of Chicago, and he's just pointing out this very thing. He's saying, I'm sitting here with colleagues who are holding completely contradictory thoughts in the same place, at the same time, about the same thing, which, again, used to get you spanked intellectually. Your peers would just mock you because how can you, it's raining and not raining at the same time, same place? This is just nonsense. And now it's become a higher wisdom. And that's not a Christian throwing rocks. This is, one of the better-known academics pointing out what was happening in the university itself. And they weren't using the word postmodernism. When I was at CU in the early 90s, nobody ever heard of that word before. None of my professors ever read any of these guys. All right, that only came out a little bit later. So it's really in the last 10 years that this has become such a dominant theme in a lot of universities. When I was at CU, nothing. At DU, starting in 1999 until now, it's dominated by postmodernism. So culture is in the midst of changing in some ways. Now, let's take this apart for a second. Since this is so easy to deal with, since it just contradicts itself, what is this other motivation going on? Because I think Nietzsche's point is really well taken. Once you throw out God, all things are up in the air. Meaning is whatever you bring to the table. Value is whatever you hold valuable. Ethics are whatever you think. Well, that may be right for you, but it's not right for me. In some sense, simply put, this is the long war against God. And it really goes back to the garden. I don't mean to theologize about this for a second here, but it really is true. The temptation to Adam and Eve was, you will be as God. You'll be in charge. You get to do what you want. Now, that's all over the New Age. But there's a reason why the New Age and postmodernism fit so well together. That's why my study on Nietzsche and his interest in Buddhism and Hinduism is so interesting, because this is a connection that goes back 120 years, and Heidegger was playing with Buddhism, and some of these other guys that played with it, Foucault was into Zen Buddhism. I don't think these connections are accidental. They're all against the mind, and they're all against the moral authority of God. You get to decide for yourself what's right and wrong, and nobody can tell you wrong. And, oh, by the way, now we have an intellectual theory which will back this up, postmodernism. I'll give you a different version. My professor at CU, my Nietzsche professor, is a guy named Bob Rogers. He's long retired now. Total atheist, total mad dog in a lot of ways, chasing girls, but that's another story. He was giving us this whole thing about Nietzsche and Nietzsche's perspectivalism. He loved this stuff. Oh, he was so excited. He was passionate about it. Good atheist that he was. And one day, I happened to turn on the Discovery Channel. We didn't do any talk about Nietzsche's life. And I was turning on Discovery or History Channel, something like that, and they had this thing on Nietzsche. So I'm listening and learning. And it's got this whole thing about this argument between Nietzsche and his sister. It was the one woman that he actually loved. And he writes her several critical letters where he's attacking her because she is dating an anti-Semite publisher, late 1870s, 1880s. When entire political parties were rising up in Germany, they're anti-Semitic. And for all the fact that Hitler loved Nietzsche, Nietzsche was not an anti-Semite. He certainly attacked Judaism and Christianity, but he did not attack the Jews as a race per se. And he hated people that thought that way. So when his sister's dating a guy that's one of the major anti-Semitic figures in Germany, Nietzsche just rips all over. Well, how could you date such a low-life, blah, 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 blah. So I'm fascinated listening to all this on the channel. So the next day I go to class, obnoxious little me, and he's getting into his sermon again about how wonderful Nietzsche is. And I just raised my hand and said, Dr. Rogers, could you help me understand something? And then I went through the whole thing I just told you. I said, at the end of this, I said, so how is it that Nietzsche had the right to criticize his sister for dating this guy if all truth really is just perspective? And I kid you not, this is what my professor did. He put his head down like this. And he goes, we have a ghost in here. Now, believe me, everybody around the room is like, what is with this guy? He's freaking out. And he goes, Nietzsche failed. He couldn't make sense out of it. And then there's the greatest Kierkegaardian leap. He says, but I just know, someday, somebody's going to make this work. Which I was just fascinated by. It's true 2 + 2 doesn't equal 5, but someday it will. I mean, Bob was a modernist philosopher. You actually couldn't contradict yourself and get away with it. As much as he was enamored by the attraction of this, no rules, you get to do what you want, there's no God up there, all we have is perspective. As much as he liked that sort of thing, he realized it contradicted itself. As soon as you say it, it contradicts itself. So he had to kind of punt on that. Postmodernists just, I guess Bob just didn't see the postmodern move coming, where they take this and glorified it. Of course it's irrational. That makes it even better. Head of my committee at DU is a guy named Carl Raspy, Christian fella, in a lot of weird ways. Carl thinks this is the epitome of faith, that this is irrational. This is what faith means, is to be irrational for Carl. And he wants to say that's what Luther was doing. Luther was irrational. And most of us who read it go, what? Say a lot of things about Luther, but he was not irrational. He was against humanist version of reason instead of the Bible. But all you have to do is read The Bondage of the Will or some of Luther's other books. He's very rational. Here's my reasons why the Pope is wrong and why the Church is wrong. It's a detailed argument. But for Carl, this kind of nonsensical statement is what the Christian ought to be in the business of doing. Not worrying about rationality, not being hung up by that. The more you're diving over the ditch off a cliff hoping somebody's there to catch you, that's real faith for Carl. So he's become one of the big postmodern guys. And oh, joy of joys, he's the head of my committee. It's a fun world out there. About 3 years ago, I took a class on Nietzsche again, this time from Carl, and he got so mad at me, just ripped all over my paper. I mean, real personal. It was really weird because I was friends with Carl before I ever entered the program there. And the irony was, he kept saying, you just missed it. You don't understand what Nietzsche's saying. So I wrote him back. I said, excuse me, Carl, help me understand something. According to Nietzsche, everybody has nothing but interpretation. How are you to say my interpretation is any worse than anybody else's? I mean, by your own standard. It's just interpretation. How can you say mine's not closer to the truth? There is no closer to the truth because there's no truth for Nietzsche. Come on. I just basically pointing out his inconsistency. But again, for Carl, this is faith, to be irrational. Because faith and reason are well separated by Kant. They're not in this class, by the way. And you can find Christians going way, way back. If you look at Augustine, Augustine had this famous statement like this: I believe that I might understand. That's his way of putting faith and reason together. Augustine was a pagan, you might call him a New Ager philosopher. And then he gets saved, and basically says, for the first time in my life, I can think well. I used to think 2 + 2 = 5, and now it equals 4, and I can think. So I believe that I might understand. It was my conversion to Christ that freed my brain from all the stupidity I'd always held on to. And I would argue that's the exact same thing that I've experienced. But he's still keeping faith and reason together. The issue for Christians forever is which one's on top. Or are they side by side or something like this. Never until Kierkegaard were they separated, until Kant. But now they are, at least in a lot of people's minds. Part of what I try to do when I witness to people is go back, they're not really separated. We still live our life on the basis of facts. One of my way of dealing with professors, there was a guy at CCU that was teaching this kind of stuff big time several years ago. The author is dead, everybody deconstructs, the meaning is, whatever you want it to be, and all this kind of nonsense. And I said, well, you know what, the best way to test if he really believes this or not is next time he gets his paycheck, just cut a couple zeros off. Instead of getting $5,000 a month, let him get $50 a month. I guarantee he's going to go into the bursar's office and demand, on the basis of his written contract, that he's supposed to get $5,000. And I don't think he's going to want the bursar to say something like this. Well, Dr. Williams, the author's really dead on this contract. And meaning is so open. And I know you think it means $5,000, but for us it means $50,000. And who are you to say we're wrong? I don't think he's going to accept that. Do you? This is a form of intellectual hypocrisy. That's all it is. There's a great commercial for Oak Express that I've always used for the New Age, but it really applies in this sector. Some of you remember seeing this a few years ago where this guy brings his car in to this New Age garage, and the guy's doing muscle testing on his arm, and calipers, and the guy's, what? And then at the end of the commercial, it's got this guy doing sage, burning sage all around the car, trying to heal it. You don't want a mechanic that acts that way, do you? And I don't want a brain surgeon that acts that way. And I don't want a pilot on a plane that acts that way. In fact, I can't think of a place in my life, other than somehow the philosophy department, where somebody's that off. I want somebody who actually believes in facts and buttons. If I'm flying in an airplane, I just came back from Birmingham this weekend. If I'm flying in an airplane, I don't want to hear the pilot come on. This is, of course, a pre-9/11 joke, but I don't want to hear the pilot come on and say something like this. Well, there are many buttons and many switches, and it really doesn't matter which one you push or pull. And after all, I've had all this training, but who am I to say my way is right? And so anybody from the back of the plane, if you'd like to come up and push whatever buttons and pull whatever switches you want, it's okay with me. No, I don't think any of us want to hear that. We want somebody who knows what he's doing who's familiar with the laws of physics and all these other things that are involved with flight, who knows how to run a plane. We want him doing that. And the same reason we want somebody driving a car or baking a cake. It gets real simplistic if you think about it. All right? There are certain things that don't work. There's reasons why certain ways of making a cake are right. You don't put arsenic in it. You don't put bricks in it. You don't put cement mix in it. I don't know why. It's all the same. Who am I to say the community over there that thinks that way is wrong? See how silly this can get? That's my point. Most of this is just silly. As soon as Michael Foucault says, different version, all truth is a power play. Foucault. What is that? Sounds to me like he's making a statement about truth. So if I take him seriously, that itself is a power play for homosexual activists like himself. Even if I take him as serious, it diffuses itself. And that's the one thing about, the postmoderns. We don't believe in big T truths anymore. Oh, no big T truths. All we have is little community T's. And every little community is the same as others. So this is bad. But wait a second. Who had a high enough place on the mountain to decide that there's no big T truth anymore? I actually used this illustration with my Nietzsche professor on this 20 years ago now. I said, let's suppose we're all under a river. But none of us really know we're under the river. We just exist in the water. And there's different piles of rocks. And some people have a higher pile of rocks than others. But all we really have is these piles of rocks. Now, that's basically my definition or my analogy for perspectivalism, or the idea that all opinions are just perspectives, they're all true. So my point was, where did Nietzsche get a pile of rocks high enough where he could get his head above the water and realize, oh my gosh, we're all under the water? Where did he get the God's eye view? Aren't they just cheating on the story? Think of the elephant one I gave you earlier. Very famous, and a lot of you might have run into, if you've run into that one before, it might have caught you for a minute. Remember the story? Each person, each priest or whatever is touching, blind priest is touching a different part of the elephant, each one thinking that that's the truth of the elephant, when the wise, enlightened person realizes they're all touching the same thing. What's cheating about that story? Anybody? Who? It's not the priest, but you're close. The storyteller. The person who's telling the story that gives you the moral of the message at the end of the day. Enlightenment comes when you understand that they're all touching the same thing. Well, what perch did he sit on? And where does he get his sight? It's really the best way to say it. There's one person in that story who is not blind. So they're cheating. All the rest of us are unenlightened idiots, blind, but there's one person who's wise and has the truth. The arrogance of this stuff is overwhelming. But like I said, I don't care which version of this, all meta-narratives are bad. Well, what about your meta-narrative, that there's no such thing as meta-narratives? Yes, ma'am. Sure. Right. Well, number one, you cheated. Didn't you just say the truth of the story? So as soon as they say that, you got to slap them a couple times. You can't use that word. But no, let's just take it from that perspective for just a second. There's nobody there telling the story. We're all just blind people stumbling around in the dark. Who tells us we're blind? The point of the story is that there are unenlightened people, and the analogy is they're blind. They can't see. But that implies at least one person has got the real perspective on things, that there is, in fact, an elephant and that they are touching different parts of it. Right? Yes, they can see, and everybody else can't see. So the minute you say the story, you're cheating, because you're implying that we're all blind, but somebody's not. Somebody does have a God's eye view. So when a postmodern used that story, they're cheating. They're implying that Derrida has a God's eye view, but the rest of us don't. Nietzsche had a God's eye view. He could see that we're all under the river, but the rest of us can't. They're just cheating on their own terms. And like I said, as this comes through in emerging circles, it's awful. Well, let me just zoom forward to apologetics. Here's what emerging guys say. I just gave you one, Carl. The more irrational, the better. So what does real community look like then? Or what is real apologetics for the postmodern guys in the church? Well, it's about the community. We need to invite people to our community. And I remember the first time I heard this is actually from a kid who used to be in my youth group who's cursing, now has his PhD ahead of me. But Andy was laying this whole line. I mean, we have to have, we invite them to the community and they see how wonderful the Christian community is in action, and that will make them want to become a Christian. And I responded by saying, it's interesting, Andy, because 99% of the people I talk to at a New Age fair are former Christians who got burned and shredded by other Christians in their life. Just ask them. Oh, yeah, let me tell you about my dad. He was an elder. This is what he did. This is what the church did to my dad. He was a pastor. I can't tell you. I just assume when I'm talking to somebody, especially of a certain age group, say 30 and up, I'm dealing with somebody who grew up in a church and has blown it off. Every witch and Hindu and Buddhist I talked to used to be Baptist and Free Church and Assembly of God. Without fail. 2 atheists and a handful of Jews in all the years I've been doing this. So I would love to bring them back to the community. Except I'm terrified of doing it. Because the community is a place full of sinners. And we fail. So, yeah, in some idealized world where the Christian community acted like it always ought to, what a wonderful place to attract people back to. I'm not saying that they're wrong, that we should have a community acting like it should. Yes, the body of Christ ought to be acting as the body of Christ should. In fact, I always say that the reason for the growth of the New Age movement is bad American Christianity. American Christianity is the manure of the New Age. It made it grow and spread. So I'm always imploring us as Christians to live as God has called us, and I implore myself the same. The point is the community is not so attractive to bring them back. In fact, to present it any other way is just a fairy tale. Secondly, how did you do missions? Let's take Paul's terms, for example. If there was no community to speak to, was Paul just wrong? When Paul went into Athens, when Paul went into Ephesus, when he went into Corinth, there was no Christian community to point people to. So Paul, in all his arrogance, started telling them about the truth of the resurrection and stuff. How bad. Paul didn't understand the joys of Derrida. I can't understand why he would say these things. In fact, none of the apostles seem to understand, the joys of the postmodern movement. For example, John says, that which we saw, that which we heard, that which we handle with our hands, this we report to you. Peter says, we didn't make up fairy tales. We were eyewitnesses of his majesty. They seem to be implying that they actually saw these things, and they're telling this to us. Eyewitness testimony, we normally call that. It's not about an irrational leap over a cliff. It's about the fact that we were there, this is what we heard, this is what we saw, this is what we're telling you. The fairy tales come out with the Gnostics. I preached here in the church several months ago about the Da Vinci Code. And now Paul's dealing with that in Colossians. Because already there are fairy tales coming up about Jesus. All right? Jesus wasn't really a man. He looked like a man. He was a spirit who would float around. And people are actually telling the story within the first 30 years of the church. So when Peter says we didn't make up fairy tales, he's basically saying, unlike these other people, we saw him. We were with him. Okay, that makes them more credible witnesses than Cato Kalin or somebody not near the picture. The point we're making here is that the biblical framework of how they understood things, they talked about what is true hundreds of times. Okay? They talked about correspondence. Now, here's a word that people have given up on, or at least postmodernists have. Postmodernists hate what's called correspondence view of truth. But it's literally the one every one of us lives by. So if I tell my son, Johnny, did you clean your room? And he goes, yes. And you, being a good student of Johnny, will immediately go to the room and verify. Because you realize Johnny's definition of clean is not the same as your definition of clean. Wait, I told you to clean your room. You didn't make your bed, you didn't pick up your toys, you didn't hang up your clothes. Oh, like he didn't know that was part of the picture, right? We very much understand correspondence because we use it all the time. Something is true if it corresponds to reality. Not very hard. Only a philosopher can screw this one up. The old philosopher's way of saying the cat is on the mat if and only if the cat's actually on the mat. That's a simple way of saying correspondence. It's all over the Bible. Jesus, in fact, when he says, let your yes be yes and your no be no, is an appeal to correspondence. Don't lie to your neighbor. Okay? Don't bear false testimony against your neighbor. Well, what does that mean in this wonderful new postmodern context? Well, it was my truth. I don't want this to get into our legal system, but it already has. That's the point I'm bringing out here, is that the biblical framework about truth is what all of us use. So when it says Jesus and the disciples went down into Capernaum, what does that mean to us? Well, that Jesus and his disciples went down to Capernaum. What's so hard? Oh, excuse me, I forgot about Derrida and Foucault. This is really a power play when the writer of Mark or Matthew, whatever, was trying to influence into thinking this event actually happened in history. Well, why can't you just read it that Jesus and his friends went down to Capernaum? What's so, thought-challenging about that? Welcome to our little postmodern world. You have people who make these claims all day long. We just did one of these conversations in Cuisine a couple of weeks ago, and this is the one we did. Is there truth? And I was talking to this guy. He's an interesting fellow in a lot of ways. He's an engineer now. And he reads Derrida and Foucault. He reads all these people. So he was the one person in the room that was really on top of all this stuff when I was talking about it. And he kept trying to defend them. But at the end of the day, he goes, all right, I have to admit, some ideas are better than others. I said, well, thank you. You just undermine the whole postmodern farm. If some perspectives really are more accurate and more truthful than other perspectives. Think about this in an even larger sense. Most of the postmoderns I know, especially postmodern Christians, will say that this is about ethical concerns. Derrida, my friend Andy, wrote this whole paper that was published in the Journal of Evangelical Philosophy, where he said Derrida is a prophet for those whose voices have not been heard. Well, that's in philosophy it's called the other, this mystical the other, people who haven't been part of the success gravy train in America or part of the philosophical or academic world. And so Andy posts this Derrida as this hero of the other, those who have been marginalized and all this kind of language. And I actually said, Andy, if you think about it, he's not only the hero, he undermines the other. Remember, there's no more truth. So all we have is our own little communities, right? That's Derrida. That's not me. So follow this for a minute, because it's actually easier to understand when it comes to ethics than maybe it does in epistemology. So here's the Nazis and the Klan, the NCAAP and the Anti-Defamation League, and sorority boys and sorority girls. I'll just pick a handful of communities out. If, in fact, there is no overriding truth that all apply to, but each makes up their own rules, and nobody has the right to say anything else is wrong, then if the frat boys want to rate the sorority girls, who am I to say they're wrong? Imagine if this was the perspective of the people up at CU in the last few years when this became a monstrous issue. Or imagine, and I'm from Beaumont, Texas, so I can say this, imagine the perspective that says, hey, who are we to say the antebellum South was wrong? I mean, that was their culture, their economy, everything was about slavery. Who are we in other places to say that was wrong? Well, let's make this even more horrific. Who are we to say that how the tight little community of Germans treat the Jewish people amongst them, who are we to say that's wrong? How can we say that's morally wrong? You're just expressing your own feelings in your community, but you're not saying anything true about the world. You're not saying it's wrong to kill people over there. See what happens? The more you take this idea seriously, you don't build concern for ethical concerns, you actually wipe it out. You come back with cultural anthropology. This is why Nietzsche says, you're dead. Good and evil is dead. Heidegger writes his whole life and probably writes 5 words on ethics. It doesn't really exist anymore. It doesn't really matter. You make it up as you go. This doesn't help to protect the underprivileged and the minority. Think of Isaiah and Jeremiah and how they talk. In Isaiah 10 and following, there's this whole thing where basically saying God's going to judge Israel. And oh, by the way, he's going to judge Tyre and Egypt and here and here. And I mean, God doesn't seem to respect these other cultures' boundaries. He seems to say, I'm sovereign, and I'm going to kick the rear end of everybody who disobeys. And he does it. Look how Jeremiah talks. Same exact language. God is sovereign. God is going to ethically judge the Jews just like he judged the Canaanites. If you do the same thing as the Canaanites, Israel, you're not going to get away. And that's why Babylon brought judgment from the hand of God. God's no respecter of cultural anthropology 101 class. He seems to say that injustice crosses national lines, and he's concerned about it, for which, frankly, I'm glad. We ought to take it seriously that there really is a judge, that there really is a God-like perspective. All right, well, you're starting to get the idea. The point I'm trying to make is that people take this stuff seriously, and they really shouldn't, because in many ways it's intellectual suicide. That's all it is. Once you say it, it contradicts itself. Ethically, it washes out real ethical concern. To me, the fact that so many people in the church want to start calling themselves emerging Christians and buy into postmodernism is one of the death knells for the American church. when the church gives up on truth. So I'm in conversation with my Buddhist friend here. Well, I mean, I believe Christianity is true. And you believe Christianity is true for you. So I'm going to tell you my story, and you're going to tell me your story. Now what? I have a former supervisor of mine with Conservative Baptist Missions who was bought into this several years ago. And he was telling me how excited he was. He doesn't have to argue for the faith anymore. He just gets to share his story. Because all there are is stories, narratives. There's no big story. There's just personal testimony. And I said, so you share your story, the Krishna shares his story, now what? At the end of it? Dialogue ends at that point? All you have is competing stories. Maybe it works for him. What do you do now? The larger point, I think, here is that once you start adopting this line, you see why pluralism is taking off in the American church. Who am I to say the Christian or the Buddhist or the Muslim is wrong? So we get Christianized versions of it. Well, I mean, Jesus works for me, and Muhammad works for him. Okay, great. It's intellectual suicide on 1,000 different levels. Imagine, all right, I have a bunch of kids, but imagine you're telling your kids, plural, well, look, Scott, I know, I mean, murder doesn't work for me, but who am I to impose my cultural values on you? And then the other brother takes a different point, and the other one takes a different. Do you see what happens? Would you ever teach your kids this way? We'll see what imperialists you really are. You're just family colonizers. What are you thinking? It's amazing to go through the university and have people talk about the evils of colonialism, and almost in the same breath, but there is no such thing as evil. Help me understand. How can there be no such thing as evil, and then you turn right around? It's just amazing how this works. There's no such thing as good and evil, but Bush is evil. All right, let's walk back through that one more time. There's no such thing as good and evil. See, this is why I said it forces you to be a walking, talking hypocrite. You can't think straight. And they don't act on the basis of this, yes?
You work with these people on a daily basis.
Yes.
How do they justify this? You just took us through an hour and a half, all the different truths and how it's evolved, which means the first truth you told us at 6 machines is no longer valid because they built the bottom line has changed. And by 7:30, you now have the all truths perspective. How do these people you deal with on a daily basis, which we run into on a daily basis, how do they justify this? Because I'm looking at it and saying, I got stupid.
You're in real trouble. They're going to have to send you to re-education camp at your factory. I'm telling you, this is what's going on, guys. If you understand, you don't understand PC thinking until you understand this whole thing. But once you understand this stuff, the PC movement gets really big because you start understanding what's going on. Since nobody's opinion is true or any better than anybody else's, you can't criticize anybody else's point of view. So how dare you say homosexuality is a sin? And if you're... yeah, I know, but if you can't let these contradictions worry you, small minds, come on. This is what happens, guys. Here's how it happens. Voices get raised and people start screaming and yelling. And they start throwing names at you. And it happens very, very fast. It can happen. I was at a psychic fair a couple years ago. I asked a question. Whenever I talk to people, and we'll go into this more detail as we go through the class. Whenever I go to a booth and there's this group or that group, I'll say, well, what is this all about? I always let them tell their whole thing first, for different reasons, which I'll go into more detail. And I said, well, can I ask you a question about that? She goes, oh, sure. So I basically, well, you said this on the one hand, but then you turned around and said that. I hadn't bought the Bible out. I don't wear a giant cross. This person started screaming at me, literally, because I questioned her, which in the larger picture of what's going on here, that implies that something she thinks is wrong and that my thinking is better than her thinking. So she's literally screaming at me in a matter of seconds. There's not a rational response to this. There's name-calling. There's threatening. You're a racist. You're a bigot. You're a Nazi. And this comes up very, very fast in these discussions. Now, the Christian version of this, the postmodern emerging guys, their response to all this is, well, you just don't really understand what we're saying. Well, okay, you've written 400 books in the last 5 years. Certainly somebody at some point is going to say something that we can understand. But there's not a rational response. It's because it's an irrational argument. But like I said, like with my professor, the irrational means faith. But it doesn't mean faith. Think in the Old Testament. I'll get your question just a second. Think in the Old Testament, how many times after God does something, especially on the Exodus, for example, how many times does God say something like this? Okay, stop, build an altar so that you may teach your children what the Lord your God has done here. Their faith was built on God's events and actions in history, as is ours, by the way. God, in fact, intervened in history. Even if I take the elephant seriously, okay, that we really are just blind people around, I've argued that I believe God was not content to let us sit there in our blindness, but rather revealed himself to us, first in his word and in the person of Jesus Christ, which is exactly basically how Hebrews starts, chapter 1. The whole point of Christianity is that God spoke to Abraham, and then he spoke to Moses, and then he spoke to Isaiah and Jeremiah, and finally he appeared amongst us in the person of Jesus himself. God actually intervened in history. This is why Kierkegaard made such a terrible mistake in my mind, to remove Christianity from history. That's why Kant made that mistake. Christianity is about what happened. And here's what happened. Here's who saw it. And how does Paul argue? Paul tells the Corinthians, I'm talking about the resurrection, and there was over 500 people. Many of you are right here who saw this. When Paul's in front of Festus, how does he argue? This didn't happen in a corner of the world, but out in the public so everybody could see it. And Festus recoils, because it's about fact. It's not about fairy tales. See, you're trying to be consistent about this sort of thing, and that, again, is going to get you back. But no, you're entirely right. What's so ironic about this coming through the education, particularly through people like Parker Palmer, who's the top graduate student teacher in the country. If these guys were consistent, what should their books look like? Empty. Why should I pay $100 for Derrida's 2 cents when it's of no more value to me than my own opinion of the plumber down the street? This is the death of education. And again, I don't have to point Christians out. I can point all sorts of secular voices like Alan Bloom or others who have said, something rotten's going on here. We're undermining, the great Western tradition, the classics and all this kind of stuff. We're throwing all that out, in favor of black, lesbian, witch perspectives on Paul as an elective. And those are actual electives at schools. I'm not kidding. And that has just as much value as studying Shakespeare. And so non-Christian educators have been pointing this out too. It's really the death of education. And if Derrida was consistent, then he should shut his mouth. His opinion has no more value than anybody else's. But my Professor Carl thought Derrida practically walked on water. The great man with wisdom. Well, what do you mean wisdom? It's just his perspective. And who cares? Well, they're going to minimize it. That was really existentialism, which stresses the individual. I call these guys group existentialists. It's still about subjectivity, but now it's wider. It's a circle. It's community or culture, whatever that means. And that's very fraught with difficulty, just trying to explain all that. I think the bottom line, this is why I said it's a long war against God. Because this is why Nietzsche is so correct. If God is dead, then good and evil washes right out. There is nobody's opinion is any higher than anybody else's. And you can see this in history. You'll see different individuals. The Marquis de Sade, famous French, gave us the word masochism and sadism and all this kind of stuff. Read de Sade. And basically he's saying the same thing. It's a French atheist. If I decide to torture these women who I'm stronger than, who are anybody else to tell me I'm wrong? And he has a point. If there's no God's eye perspective to tell him he's wrong, and it's also wrong to tell Hitler he was wrong. One of my friends, Bill Jack, who does a lot of apologetics type stuff, Bill was at the University of Colorado about 12 years ago. None of us had ever heard the word postmodern before at this time. Bill went into the English class at CU Boulder, future lawyers, doctors, teachers. This will throw you. He said, how many of you think that what Hitler did was wrong? Not a single student raised their hand. Not one. And he says, is anybody in here Jewish? And one girl raised her hand. And he goes, surely you of all people would say that what Hitler did was wrong. Now listen to how thoroughly, at the time we were calling it just plain old relativistic. Listen to what she said. She goes, well, I would never do what he did, but I can't say he's wrong. That's 12 years ago before postmodernism even had a name. This is our culture. They've just bought into this idea that you can't criticize anybody. And the Christianized version, we shouldn't judge. Oh, you're right. I was going to say something wrong about, it's wrong for that guy to rape your daughter, but hey, who am I to judge? It just gets stupid after about 3 seconds. That's when you have to realize there's so much more going on here. And it is about autonomy, and that's why I said it's about going right back to the garden. I'm going to be my own God. I'm going to determine what's right and wrong for me, and nobody has the right to tell me I'm wrong. And every witch I've ever talked to, that's dogma. That's gospel for them. Oh, we're out of time, too. So, last question. Well, let me quote the Bible on that one. The verse used to be in our prayer cards. It's 1 Timothy 4:1, where Paul says, the Spirit clearly says in the later times, many will depart from the faith and give heed to doctrines of demons and deceptive spirits. And I would argue that there's very few deceptive spirits. We got demons of everything today. I didn't do it. It was a demon of fill in the blank. Demon of lust, demon of greed, demon of eating too many cheeseburgers. There's a demon for everything. That's wrong. On the other hand, there is doctrines of demons, this interesting phrase. It's the only time it's used in the Bible. And I think I run into that everywhere. And there's even some very prominent New Age writers who have pointed out that connection to the story of Adam and Eve. Only their twist in the story is Lucifer was the good guy in the story, Jehovah was the bad guy. Lucifer wanted us to discover that we are truly gods. It was Jehovah, that mean, jealous God, who wanted to keep us in our ignorance. And some of the more prominent New Agers write that on their books. So they're actually making that connection as well. And that's what I'm saying. We don't need deceptive spirits necessarily. There are out there, I believe that. But the doctrines of demons is all over the place. There are hundreds of millions of people who think they're gods. And it's kind of like Animal Farm. If you remember the end of Animal Farm, where the animals go out and the rules have been written down, all animals are equal and blah, blah, blah. And then at the end they get, all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. Well, that's the guru world. That's the world of the Derridas and the Guru Maharaj Mahesh Yogi. All of us are divine beings, but some are a little bit more enlightened than the rest of us. That's why we must pay attention to them. That's why we must pay them tuition. That's why we must buy their books, even though what they say is no more important than anybody else. Funny little thing about us, we keep buying the same lies. So again, do your reading on the list for tonight, because it'll go into these things in more detail. And a couple of those articles, if you can type them in. And the regular syllabus will be on our website in about 2 weeks, because our syllabus is being changed now. Our web server is being changed right now. But I'll have this all online so you can actually go on and just click it so you can go to it quick. But I had 2 articles from emerging church guys, so I'll let you hear for themselves what they're saying. So I'm not just throwing rocks at them. You can hear it out of their own lips. And there's a lot more to this discussion, obviously. But next week we'll take on we're going to have to pick up some stuff we didn't catch tonight. We'll pick up some more stuff. Let's pray. Father, thanks again for love and mercy and grace. And Father, free our minds from our own self-deceptions and from that of our culture. And from the evil one's lies. Who is busy spreading lies everywhere. Father, your word says you are the truth. And it says it over and over again. Help us to pay heed to that at all times. And not listen to the cry of our culture to give up that. Lord, I pray for each person here that you give them a passion for you and a passion for your truth and a passion for your sheep and for lost sheep as well. Father, we thank you for your love and mercy, by which all of us would be deceived without that. And we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.